advisors living in limbo land. Last year, they passed the legislation on December 30th, 2014. How much can you do in 2 business days where nobody's doing business, actually? So, yes.
Can I tell a
Yeah.
story about that? It's called the IRA charitable rollover, and it actually got passed the first time with George W. Bush in August of 2006.
Wow.
And it's been in effect every year since, but as you're right, when they passed it on December 31st, they always date it back retroactively to the beginning of the year. So we tell everybody, if you're 70 and a half, act as if it's going to pass, because it always has since 2006, every single time, just in a dilatory fashion. The story I want to tell is that I was in Kokomo, Indiana in 2006 after this passed, and a couple wanders into the Community Foundation. They have a farm. They used to grow popcorn for the Orville Redenbacher Popcorn Factory. They've incorporated their farm. They're gifting shares to the girls. She has gone into a coma. She was in a coma for 3 months, and she woke up, and all of a sudden, planning became real. I told them about this brand new act, brand new off the presses, and that year he takes $100,000 out of his IRA, and the next year she takes $100,000 out of her IRA. They said, we will never be able to give $200,000 to charity without taxes. They said this is an incredible opportunity. So I'm so glad, Scott, you've not just talked about it satisfying the required minimum distribution, but it's the big gift. If somebody's older, they don't need that. Wow, this is an awesome opportunity to do something mighty big.
And just to take it one more step clearer, this is available for people over the age of 70. And as you may know, at age 70 and a half, everybody needs to start taking money out of their retirement plans, whether it be IRAs. It's called the minimum distribution requirement, or required minimum distribution. So it's calculated based upon life expectancy. So everybody, once they reach this age, has to start taking money out of their IRA or 401k. Where this becomes very powerful is if they use part of their required minimum distribution to go to the charitable organization. Take an example. Say they have to take $100,000 out of their $2 million IRA every year. Well, they don't, let's just paint a picture where they don't really need all that $100,000. They have other sources of income, so maybe they only need, for their living purposes, $50,000. Well, wouldn't it make a whole lot of sense to use the other $50,000 to give to charitable purposes and avoid the taxation that they'd otherwise, because they're going to have to take that $100,000 out and be taxed on all of it. If they don't need it, this is a great means to satisfy and become tax advantaged. Okay. I think I have to pick up the pace here, don't I, Jim? Okay. Gift of life insurance, I won't spend a lot of time talking about this, and this is still a lifetime technique where a person can irrevocably transfer to a charitable organization their insurance policy that they feel they don't need anymore. And the value of that gift is the cash value inside the insurance policy. And they get a deduction for that. I raised the question, who pays premiums? This isn't, generally speaking, for charitable organizations, I find, the most popular thing to receive. Okay. Because if it's a paid-up insurance policy, as they call it, in other words, there's no required additional premiums, that's fine. Everything works well. But if the insurance policy to stay in effect requires continuing premiums, the question becomes, who pays the premiums? Oftentimes the donor wants to get rid of the policy and doesn't want to continue to pay the premiums. So, the charitable organization could pay the premiums. That's a tough bullet to swallow for most charitable organizations, I find. So I don't see a lot of life insurance being contributed. Okay, now we're switching gears into the planned giving arena. And by that I mean mostly that this is something that happens out into the future, generally speaking, at death, and comes about again, basically, or generally speaking, this gets executed, gets documented in the form of the person's will or their trust or a combination of the two even, and their beneficiary designations. Remember when we were talking about IRAs and life insurance for that matter, they don't operate under a will, generally speaking. They operate because you name a beneficiary of IRAs and life insurance policies. So they're outside of the probate estate typically. And generally speaking, again, most plan gifts are revocable, can be changed. So if a person, if their thoughts change over time, it's encouraging to them, it's helpful to them to know they're not locking in place their final plans. It, I think, would be useful to just spend a moment talking about death taxation, because the climate has changed very significantly over the last decade, and in particular probably the last 5 years. So there is such a thing called a federal estate tax. It's a big tax, but the good news is that the exemption that every person has, that as recently as 10 to 12 years ago was $600,000 for each person, is now, in 2015, $5,430,000. And when you take the typical married couple, multiply the $5,430,000 times 2, that's nearly $11 million that a couple can have and not pay any federal estate tax. Why do we care so much about that? Because the tax starts at 40%. So to the degree that anybody has, a married couple has more than $11 million in today's world, they're going to start paying a pretty hefty tax. This was something, as estate planners, we constantly worried about. The good news is, I don't know what the statistic is, but I'm guessing that $11 million net worth puts somebody in the top half of 1%. They're above 1%ers. They're probably half of 1%ers, maybe even a quarter of 1%ers. So it's very few that have to worry about this. The other good news is that the Indiana inheritance tax, another death tax, was repealed in 2012. So as of July 1st, 2012, we don't have this tax, and it wasn't a big tax, but it was a natty kind of annoying thing to have to go through when you handle a person's estate. Another thing for you to understand about taxation around death is there's something called a stepped-up basis, and this is commonly forgotten or not understood at all. But basically, every asset that a person owns gets revalued as of their date of death. So whether it's a stock or whether it's cash or whether it's art or a house, everything gets revalued as of that date of death. And now, think about that example of the appreciated stock, of giving that appreciated stock. Well, if the donor holds on to that stock, upon their death, they get it elevated up to that $50,000 level that was the real value of the stock. So it's from an income tax vantage point, this is another very important thing. And how does it play into charitable giving? Well, lots of times, I know personally, I've been doing what I've been doing for about 30 years, so I have a lot of older clients. And it comes down to they have all these stocks that have appreciated. They don't really want to sell them. They give some of them to charities, but there becomes a dilemma of this little gruesome or ghoulish, but comes down to, should we give or sell these stocks because they've become way too big a part of the portfolio, or should we wait and get them revalued and stepped up in basis when the person dies?